In the autumn of 1415, northern France lay heavy under unseasonable rain. The field between the villages of Tramecourt and Agincourt were plowed earth, dark, clay-thick soil that swallowed boots and hose alike. Farmers had already turned the ground for winter planting. It was not a battlefield. It was farmland, and yet within days, it would become the site of one of the most shocking military reversals in medieval Europe. An army that outnumbered its enemy by at least 2 to 1, perhaps 3, would collapse in the mud. The mounted nobility of France, heirs to centuries of chivalric warfare, would be broken not by cavalry charges or heroic duels, but by exhaustion, terrain, and disciplined volleys of arrows. The battle would enter legend, but nothing about it was inevitable. To understand why the French elite fell at Agincourt, one must begin not with arrows, but with ambition. In 1413, the English crown passed to a young king, Henry V of England. He was 26 years old, hardened by rebellion during his father's reign, and determined to legitimize his authority through military success. England was politically fragile. The memory of internal revolt still lingered. The monarchy required prestige, something visible, undeniable, and rooted in victory. Across the Channel, France was divided by internal crisis. King Charles VI of France suffered recurring bouts of severe mental illness. During these episodes, he failed to recognize his own family and was incapable of governance. Power fell into the hands of rival noble factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, whose competition often escalated into violence. France was wealthy, populous, and militarily formidable, but it was politically fractured. Henry V saw opportunity. His claim to the French throne was not new. It stretched back generations to Edward III, but Henry approached it with calculation rather than rhetoric. He demanded territory in Normandy and Aquitaine, financial concessions, and recognition of his dynastic rights. The demands were substantial, intentionally so. Negotiations stalled. In August 1415, Henry landed in Normandy with approximately 12,000 men. The campaign began with the siege of Harfleur. It was a slow, grinding operation. The town resisted longer than expected. Disease spread among the English ranks, dysentery in particular. By the time Harfleur surrendered in late September, Henry's army had been reduced significantly. Thousands were dead or incapacitated. Many advisors urged him to return to England. The objective, securing Harfleur, had been achieved. But Henry chose something riskier. He would march north through French territory toward the English-held port of Calais. It would be a demonstration of strength, a chevauchée, a raid designed to provoke response and assert dominance. But France was not unprepared. French nobles began assembling forces to intercept him. Unlike previous campaigns, this would not be a scattered response. The French intended to block his path and force battle on ground of their choosing. As Henry's army marched, it shrank further. Sickness lingered. Supplies thinned. Morale was strained by fatigue and uncertainty. The men who remained were hardened veterans, but they were fewer than planned. Perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 effectives remained, of which the majority were longbowmen. The English longbow was not new. It had already proven decisive at Crécy and Poitiers decades earlier, but those victories had relied on favorable positioning and French miscalculation. The French nobility remembered those defeats, but they interpreted them as failures of execution, not flaws in doctrine. They believed they had learned. Meanwhile, Henry moved deliberately. His march was not reckless. Scouts screened his flanks. He avoided fortified towns. When bridges over the Somme were destroyed or defended, he maneuvered upstream in search of crossing points. Each delay increased pressure. French forces gathered in growing numbers ahead of him. The French command structure reflected the kingdom's divisions. With Charles VI incapacitated, leadership fell to high-ranking nobles, including the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret. The Dukes of Orleans, Bourbon, and Alsace were present. So too were dozens of prominent lords eager to restore French martial prestige. The mood in the French camp was confident. Reports suggested the English were exhausted and weakened. Their numbers were known to be small. For many French nobles, this confrontation promised redemption for earlier humiliations. A decisive cavalry assault, properly coordinated, would crush the invaders. Yet confidence can distort judgment. By mid-October, French forces successfully maneuvered ahead of Henry's route to Calais. They blocked the road near the small village of Agincourt. The English, after days of rain and forced marches, found their path obstructed by a numerically superior army. Henry could not easily retreat. The Somme crossings were behind him. French detachments shadowed his movements. Provisions were nearly exhausted. He would have to fight. On October 24th, the two armies encamped within sight of each other. The distance between them was less than a mile. That night, rain fell steadily. The freshly plowed fields turned to deep mud. For the English, the situation was stark. Outnumbered, ill, and hungry, they faced a force that may have numbered 15,000 to 20,000, perhaps more. The exact figure remains debated, but the disparity was undeniable. Yet Henry did not withdraw into despair. He surveyed the terrain carefully. The battlefield was constricted by woodland on both flanks, the forests of Tramcourt and Agincourt forming natural barriers. The open field between them was narrow, perhaps 750 to 1,000 yards wide at most. The French numerical advantage would be compressed. Their ability to deploy large cavalry formations would be limited. The mud, however, would affect both sides. English longbowmen carried stakes, sharpened wooden posts designed to be driven into ground at angles facing the enemy. These would disrupt cavalry charges and protect archers from direct assault. But driving stakes into soaked earth required effort. It would be done under tension. That evening, Henry ordered silence in camp. Discipline was strict. He knew morale could fracture under the weight of odds. Across the field, the French nobles debated order of battle, questions of precedence, who would command the vanguard, who would take position of honor, consumed time. In aristocratic warfare, rank mattered. To stand in the front line was both risk and privilege. But debate delayed clarity. The French plan, broadly conceived, involved a mounted vanguard to disrupt English archers, followed by dismounted men-at-arms advancing through the center. Additional lines would reinforce and overwhelm. It was a plan built on numerical superiority and shock power. What it did not fully account for was terrain degradation overnight, or the psychological strain of advancing under sustained missile fire across constricted ground. At dawn on October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, the rain ceased. Mist hung low over the field. Two armies faced each other in silence. For the English, survival required cohesion and discipline beyond their numbers. For the French elite, victory seemed certain, provided execution matched expectation. The field between them was less than 1,000 yards. It would become a corridor of compression, exhaustion, and collapse. The conditions were set, and the smallest army on the field was about to redefine medieval warfare. Dawn on October 25th, 1415 revealed two armies drawn up across a sodden expanse of freshly plowed farmland, each aware that the coming hours would determine more than survival. The English force under Henry V of England stood in disciplined silence, their numbers visibly thin, their banners fewer than tradition demanded of a royal host. Perhaps 6,000 effectives remained, and of these, roughly 5,000 were longbowmen. The remainder were men-at-arms, knights and esquires fighting dismounted, armored in plate and mail, prepared to hold a fixed defensive line. Illness had reduced them. Fatigue had hollowed their faces. Yet their formation was deliberate. Henry placed his men-at-arms in the center, forming a dense block designed to absorb frontal assault. On either flank, archers angled forward in projecting formations, creating a shallow crescent intended to funnel attackers inward. Each archer carried not only his bow, often as tall as a man himself, but also a mallet and sharpened wooden stakes. Before the battle, these stakes were driven into the soft ground at forward angles, forming a jagged defensive hedge. The preparation was methodical, almost mechanical. Every man understood that if cavalry reached the line intact, the English would be overrun. Across a narrowing field, the French army presented a different image. It was larger, layered, and socially complex. Command rested nominally with the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, but real authority was diffused among high nobles, including the Dukes of Alençon and Bourbon. The absence of King Charles VI of France, incapacitated and far from the field, meant that no singular sovereign presence imposed unified command. Instead, decisions emerged from council, and council had been shaped by pride as much as prudence. The French army likely numbered between 12 and 20,000, though precise figures remain debated. What is clear is that it significantly outmatched the English. Its strength lay in heavy cavalry and heavily armored men-at-arms, mounted nobles whose status was intertwined with battlefield valor. Many had arrived eager to erase the memory of Crécy and Poitiers. They did not view the English position as tactically sophisticated. Rather, they saw a weakened foe cornered against woodland, ripe for decisive shock action. The French formation reflected traditional doctrine. The vanguard consisted of mounted men-at-arms tasked with riding down the English archers and scattering them before sustained arrow fire could destabilize the main assault. Behind this mounted element stood a dense line of dismounted nobles, heavily armored, arranged shoulder to shoulder. Further back, additional lines waited in reserve. The expectation was straightforward. Cavalry would disrupt, infantry would crush, reserves would exploit. Yet the battlefield itself imposed constraints that doctrine had not fully absorbed. The space between the woods of Tramcourt and Agincourt compressed the deployment area. Instead of sweeping lateral maneuver, the French advance would be channeled forward. The night's rain had transformed the plowed soil into adhesive mud. Horses would struggle for traction. Armored men would sink with each step. Armor that signified invulnerability in dry conditions now added weight that compounded exhaustion. For several hours after dawn, neither side advanced. The French believed time favored them. The English were short on supplies and could not sustain prolonged standoff. Hunger and sickness were allies to France. Henry understood this as well. Remaining stationary invited deterioration, yet advancing across open ground toward superior numbers risked catastrophic loss. The standoff carried psychological weight. English soldiers stood in silence beneath overcast sky, aware of how few they were. Many had survived Harfleur only to face annihilation here. Their king moved along the line, ensuring alignment and reinforcing discipline. He did not indulge in theatrics. His authority rested in visible composure. The men-at-arms tightened ranks. Archers tested bowstrings made slack by damp air. Every detail mattered. A longbow's power depended on dryness and maintenance. Quivers were protected as best as possible, though the humidity lingered. Eventually, Henry made a calculated decision. Rather than wait for starvation to dictate terms, he ordered a controlled forward advance, closing the distance sufficiently to bring the longbows within effective range. This was a gamble, but a measured one. The English line moved as a cohesive body, stakes pulled and replanted. When they halted, the range had narrowed to perhaps 250 yards. It was close enough. At Henry's signal, the first volleys began. The sound was not a single crack, but a rolling hiss. Thousands of arrows cutting through damp air in arcs that briefly obscured the sky. Each longbowman could loose multiple arrows per minute, and the cumulative effect was immediate. Horses in the French vanguard reacted first. Armor could deflect some projectiles, but not all. Gaps at joints, visors, and flanks presented vulnerabilities. More critically, horses were far less protected. Arrows striking a charging mount could wound, panic, or kill it outright. The first mounted advance faltered as animals lost cohesion. Mud compounded confusion. Hooves slipped. Riders attempting to accelerate found themselves constrained by the churned earth and by one another. The narrow frontage prevented wide flanking maneuvers. Instead of a sweeping charge, the French cavalry pressed into a congested funnel under sustained missile fire. Those horses that reached the English stakes encountered another barrier. The angled wooden posts forced riders to slow or attempt awkward navigation. In that hesitation, arrows continued to fall. Some French knights dismounted voluntarily. Others were thrown as their mounts stumbled or collapsed. The intended shock of the cavalry assault dissipated into fragmented collisions. Instead of breaking the archers, the mounted vanguard recoiled, disorder spreading backward into their own advancing infantry. Behind them, the main body of French men-at-arms began its forward march. Heavily armored, they advanced on foot, shields raised, visors lowered. Their armor offered substantial protection against glancing shots, but penetration was not the sole objective of English archery. Even non-lethal impacts accumulated. Arrows striking armor produced concussive force. Those striking limbs could penetrate mail gaps. More importantly, movement through mud demanded enormous energy. Each step required lifting weighted greaves from suctioning earth. As the front ranks slowed, those behind continued pressing forward. Compressing the formation, space to maneuver vanished. Shoulders locked. Men stumbled and were forced upright by pressure from the rear. English archers adjusted aim, targeting horses' visors and any visible weakness. They were not indiscriminately firing. They were trained to exploit vulnerability. When the French line closed within melee distance, archers dropped bows and drew secondary weapons. Mallets, hatchets, short swords. Their mobility contrasted sharply with the encumbered nobles before them. The English men-at-arms in the center braced for impact as the leading French elements crashed into them. The collision was not a dramatic cinematic clash, but a grinding shove. Mud prevented rapid footwork. Combat became claustrophobic, breath confined within visors. Visibility narrowed to inches. The French numerical advantage could not be fully realized because the terrain limited how many could engage simultaneously. Those in rear ranks found themselves pushing forward without clear sight of the enemy. Communication deteriorated under the din of metal and the suffocating proximity of bodies. When individuals fell, rising was nearly impossible without assistance. Some were trampled. Others suffocated beneath the weight of comrades. The second French line, attempting to reinforce the first, encountered congestion. Instead of orderly waves, the assault stacked upon itself, density becoming liability. Henry maintained position slightly behind his front line, surrounded by a small retinue. He was not removed from danger. At one point, French nobles reportedly reached close proximity to him, and his brother, the Duke of Gloucester, was wounded. The English king's presence in the thick of combat stabilized morale. Withdrawal would have triggered collapse. Instead, the English line held. The archers, having exhausted initial volleys, now fought with brutal efficiency at close quarters, exploiting the inability of heavily armored opponents to recover balance in mud. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the French advance lost momentum. Fatigue spread rapidly among men encased in steel, struggling for breath within confined helmets. The mud had become adhesive, pulling at sabotants and trapping fallen bodies. The carefully conceived French order of battle dissolved into localized struggles for survival. Signals could not travel effectively through the crush. What had begun as a confident advance transformed into a suffocating press of men unable to deploy their strength. The English, fewer but positioned on firmer psychological ground. Sense a shift. They were fighting for survival. The French had been fighting for prestige. That difference sharpened resolve. The battlefield narrowed, not only physically but psychologically. The elite of France were being ground down, not by singular heroic strokes, but by attrition shaped by terrain and disciplined missile fire. The engagement had ceased to resemble traditional chivalric warfare. It had become something more mechanical, more unforgiving. And within that compression, the French line began to buckle. By mid-morning, the field at Agincourt had become a crucible. Mud, rain, and the sheer weight of armor had sapped the French offensive. Men-at-arms who had expected to sweep the English from the field now struggled to maintain footing. Some of the most celebrated knights in France, burdened by plate and mail, sank to their knees in the soil. The English line, thin but disciplined, pressed outward in a tightening grip. The longbows now supplemented by close-quarter weapons as the French forces became interlocked. Every step forward for French meant fighting through fallen comrades. Every swing of a sword was met with equal force from an enemy who had chosen the ground and built a prepared defense. The intended shock of numbers dissolved into a static struggle, where courage mattered but could not overcome logistical realities. Horses that had survived initial volleys now lay dead or floundering, further disrupting the advance. The terrain had become a weapon in itself, one the English had leveraged without a single charge. The turning point was subtle yet irreversible. As more French troops pressed forward, the crush at the front line increased, creating localized zones of panic. Men could not see the broader battle. They could not assess the enemy's numbers. Their world had contracted to the width of the plowed field and the bodies immediately around them. Archers, previously firing from a distance, now hacked and struck at limbs and joints exposed by the strain of mud and armor. Individual knights, once confident in personal prowess, found themselves immobilized by circumstances they could not command. Exhaustion compounded fear. A single stumble could cascade into a chain reaction, pulling entire groups into collapse. The psychological weight of seeing comrades trapped and helpless became as debilitating as the physical effort required to move through the quagmire. Leaders in the French ranks attempted to rally their forces, issuing commands to push forward, to regroup, to maintain cohesion. But in the chaos, words were lost, orders were misinterpreted or drowned out by cries, the clash of metal and the squelch of mud under boots and hooves. As the struggle ground on, the English exploited every moment with grim calculation. Longbowmen, now at close range, targeted the faces and necks of heavily armored men. And when the line pressed too far forward, the stakes planted at intervals tore open avenues that slowed cavalry and funneled infantry into kill zones. Archers jabbed with their spears and mallets, striking ankles, calves, and hands. Men-at-arms, trained to expect frontal shock attacks in open ground, found themselves trapped between immovable obstacles and a determined, coordinated enemy. The compression of the French lines, once a source of strength, now worked against them. The English were not merely defending, they were channeling, focusing the momentum of a numerically superior foe into zones where discipline and preparation amplified the effectiveness of every soldier. The battlefield became a machine in which the English were the controlling mechanism, and the French the moving parts that jammed under pressure. Within 2 hours of initial engagement, cracks appeared in the French cohesion. The vanguard, largely dismounted and stuck in mud, could no longer advance. Some leaders tried to form new lines, but the sheer density of bodies made redeployment impossible. Panic spread in the controlled chaos. Men fell and could not rise, nobles collided with each other, horses tripped over bodies, and archers maintained relentless pressure. The English center, held by men-at-arms, absorbed repeated attacks but remained firm, their compact formation resisting the disordered French push. Henry himself moved along the line, visible but not reckless, offering command presence that reinforced a sense of order among his soldiers. From the perspective of the French, the ground had turned into a trap, one in which the normal advantages of heavy cavalry and superior numbers were neutralized. Pride and expectation now confronted the unforgiving reality of environment and disciplined opposition. By mid-morning, the battle shifted from contest of skill to contest of endurance. Exhaustion, injury, and psychological strain dominated. French knights struggled not only against the English, but against the physical and logistical constraints imposed by mud, weight, and compression. Those unable to continue were pressed downward, creating impassable blocks of men and horses. The order of precedence among nobles, which earlier dictated who led and who followed, became irrelevant in the face of chaos. Attempted reorganizations failed repeatedly. Retreat was almost impossible without exposing oneself to English archers. Every attempt to push forward increased mortality within the front ranks. Those in reserve could not reach the field effectively because the narrow corridor and massed bodies blocked movement. The intended sequence of vanguard, main line, and reinforcement dissolved into a single, suffocating crush. The collapse accelerated when individual units of the French attempted to flank or bypass obstacles. Splinter groups, often led by high-ranking knights, broke off in the main advance to seek less congested paths. These maneuvers exposed them to enfilading fire, and the English adjusted quickly. Archers pivoted, creating angled fields of fire, while men-at-arms extended pikes and swords into the chaos. Cavalry, once the pride of the French army, had largely been neutralized. Those that attempted renewed charges were trapped, unable to build momentum in the mud. The psychological effect on the French cannot be overstated. Noble lineage, individual valor, and armored supremacy provided little comfort when the terrain, exhaustion, and methodical English tactics dictated the pace of the fight. By the second hour, morale had fractured irreversibly. As afternoon approached, the English began controlled pushes forward, exploiting gaps caused by French collapse. Their strategy was not reckless pursuit, but deliberate compression, maintaining formation while applying pressure at key points. French men-at-arms, isolated and trapped, were overwhelmed. Many were killed where they fell, unable to retreat or regroup. Horses lay dead, bodies tangled with equipment. forming obstacles for those behind. Panic spread outward from the center. French nobles who had survived initial volleys attempted to rally scattered troops, but coordination had been extinguished. The English line, disciplined and strategically positioned, exploited the chaos rather than chasing personal glory. The psychological contrast was stark. The English fought for survival and cohesion. The French fought for honor and perceived expectation, and both motives collided disastrously under conditions neither fully controlled. By late afternoon, the battlefield resembled a graveyard of mud, steel, and broken bodies. The French army had been decisively defeated. Estimates suggest that several thousand of their number were killed, with the majority of men-at-arms either dead, captured, or incapacitated. The English losses were comparatively minor, numbering perhaps a few hundred, largely due to concentrated defense and disciplined execution. The victory, while unexpected by many contemporaries, was a result of deliberate preparation, disciplined cohesion, and the strategic use of terrain and long-range missile weapons to amplify limited numbers. Henry V had not relied on heroism alone. He had transformed environmental conditions and psychological pressure into instruments of victory.